Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. There's even a brand new Brigadier General tier where you can get a shout out on a Commander's Quarters episode that's dedicated to you. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in from the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So spoiler season is coming to a close today, but Teferi doesn't want it to end just yet, so he's gonna slow things down. Just kidding. Okay, anyways, if you haven't seen my episode on Teferi Slows the Sunset, make sure you check that one out because, yeah, there's a reason I mentioned Seedborn Muse in the thumbnail. Also, if you haven't seen my other episode from yesterday on Lear, Disciple of the Drowned, make sure you check that one out because, yeah, this commander is absolutely busted. But even early this morning, we got yet another exciting commander with Florian Voldaren Scion. But don't go check that episode out until you've watched this one because this one is on, and get ready for the name, the Meathook Massacre. And yeah, that sounds like a brutal name, and this card, believe me, is incredibly brutal. Well, for your opponents, I should say. You are very much going to enjoy this card. And yeah, the second this card was spoiled, I sent it right over to Eddie and basically said, well, I was not expecting this. So what exactly is this card and what does it do? Well, let's jump into it to find out. The Meathook Massacre, get ready for it, is a legendary enchantment for X black. When it enters the battlefield, each creature gets -X until end of turn. So first off, this is a board wipe on an enchantment, and a flexible one at that. But of course, we're nowhere near done just yet. It also says, whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life. On top of that, whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, you gain 1 life. So yeah, take a second to take this in. Okay, good? Yeah, that is brutal. This is a flexible board wipe that sticks around as an enchantment that punishes your opponents when your creatures die and gains you life when their creatures die. Yeah, this is absurd, and there are going to be a ton of decks out there that want to run this. This can easily be a game-saving board wipe, a game-ending card, and just a value engine throughout the game for you. Even if you just cast this for X equals 0, it still has a lot of value. It doesn't even need to be a board wipe, and it's still effective in the right deck, but yeah, on top of that, it is. So this is going to come down, take out the exact size of creatures that you want, and then drain your opponents for a ton and gain you a ton of life. Yeah, there's a reason that this is a mythic, and I can imagine that this one's going to be very expensive. I mean, aristocrat-style strategies are one of the most popular in the format, and I think according to EDH Rec, they're around like the 3rd most popular, and there are a ton of commanders that work well with that, and yeah, a lot of them are going to want this. And keep in mind that this can be a repeatable board wipe for the right deck. Say you're playing blue and you've got ways to bounce a non-land permanent. Well, just bounce this back to your hand, and when you need to board wipe again. There are a ton of applications for this card, and it's definitely going to end a lot of games in Commander. But now let's move on and talk about some other cards that this might be reminiscent of, or kind of like a combination of as well. First up, the first card that came to my mind was Massacre Worm, which, yes, shares the word massacre with it, so there you go. Although this is on a creature that costs 6 mana, it is quite similar to our 2 mana enchantment. Or I guess I should say again, 2 and X, regardless, 2. When Massacre Worm enters the battlefield, creatures your opponents control get -2/-2 until end of turn. And whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, that player loses 2 life. So this is a game-ending card in its own right. It comes down and it can wipe out a lot of your opponent's small creatures and drain them for a ton. But obviously there are a few key differences and actually a lot of points in the favor of the Meathook Massacre. Again, there is no flexibility with the Massacre Worm. It's a -2/-2, though it does just hit your opponent's creatures. So obviously if you want your creatures to stick around, well, they do with this. Also, this does drain your opponents for 2 life for every single one of their creatures that dies. But the potential for the Meathook Massacre is much higher. Because again, in the type of deck that's going to be running the Meathook Massacre like an Aristocrat style strategy, you're going to have a ton of small creatures. So instead of having to count on your opponents having creatures in play, you're going to be utilizing your own to drain them for a ton. So because of that, obviously you can cast Meathook Massacre for a lot less if need be. If you just want to get rid of all of your 1/1s, the Meathook Massacre only costs 3 mana in total compared to 6 for Massacre Worm. And you're probably going to be draining your opponents out for a lot more. On top of that, again, when their creatures die, you also gain life too. So the Meathook Massacre is more flexible, probably has more potential to drain even more life, and also gains you life. And on top of that, it's going to stick around for a lot longer than Massacre Worm most likely, because again, the Meathook Massacre is an enchantment, which is probably the hardest type of permanent to deal with in Commander. Unlike, a creature like Massacre Worm, which can die to a lot of things. Ironically, including a board wipe like the Meathook Massacre. Now, I'm not trying to say Massacre Worm is a bad card, in fact, it's a very good card, but yeah, that just shows how good the Meathook Massacre is, that it is better in so many ways. I mean, even without that board wipe piece, again, at basically 0 mana for that X, it's essentially a Zulaport Cutthroat, which sees a ton of play in Commander. Now, yes, it gains you life in a different way, because Zulaport Cutthroat says whenever it or another creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. But still, the important part is that you're draining your opponents when your creatures die, and yeah, it's just a nice benefit that you gain life when their creatures die. And actually, you can really take advantage of that and make it more than a benefit with some other cards, and we'll talk about those here in a bit. Regardless, cards like Zulaport Cutthroat, Cruel Celebrant, and Basher Remembrance see a ton of play in Aristocrat-style strategies, and yeah, this one is going to as well. Or at least I should say, for those decks that can afford it, because I believe, again, that this is going to be a very expensive card. But when it comes to ways to take advantage of the life gain that the Meathook Massacre is going to provide you, let's talk about cards like Marauding Blight Priest and Cliffhaven Vampire. Each of these do the exact same thing. They say whenever you gain life, each opponent loses 1 life. So now, even when your opponent's creatures die, you're going to be draining them. So now it doesn't really matter if your opponent's creatures are dying or your creatures are dying, they're getting punished regardless. And of course, you can punish them further with Sanguine Bond and Vizkopa Guildmage. Sanguine Bond says whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life. So this is more of a targeted approach. Again, if there's a board wipe, like the Meathook Massacre, you're going to be gaining a ton of life. And if there's one opponent in particular that you want to take out, well, with that life that you gained, drain that player for that much. Or you can drain all of your opponents with Vizkopa Guildmage. She has, by paying 1 white-black, whenever you gain life this turn, each opponent loses that much life. So yeah, that can get out of hand very quickly. I mean, even just outside of that life gain and life loss and synergies with that, it's just still an effective card as a board wipe, and a flexible one at that. I mean, a card like Languish might be more efficient, giving all creatures -4/-4 until end of turn for 2 black, but again, it's not flexible. When it comes to flexible board wipes, we have to talk about Toxic Deluge, even though it's an incredibly expensive card, but yeah, this one's incredibly flexible and incredibly effective in Commander. It only costs 2 and a black, and it says, as initial cost to cast this spell, pay X life, all creatures get -X until end of turn. So yeah, for the most part, this one's going to be more flexible, just allowing you to pay life instead of a ton of mana to actually get to that X value that you want. But still, again, being flexible and that you can pick whatever X value you need to for the situation that you're in is huge. And like I keep mentioning, that's on top of all the life drain and it sticking around as an enchantment. Yeah, this card's insane. I mean, it's basically like a Black Sun Zenith in a way that, again, just sticks around and provides extra value. Now, yes, there are some differences. Black Sun Zenith costs the exact same amount, and it says put X -1/-1 counters on each creature, shuffle Black Sun Zenith into its owner's library. So this is a board wipe that can have a longer lasting impact with bigger creatures. And this is also one that you can get back, technically, because it is shuffled into your library. Regardless, in basically every single deck outside of -1/-1 counter decks, the Meathook Massacre is going to be a lot more effective. Again, just sticking around and providing you extra value is absolutely absurd. And again, like I mentioned before, because it's a board wipe on a permanent, if you've got a way to bounce it back to your hand, do it again. Regardless, now that we've talked about cards that work well with it and comparable cards, let's talk about some commanders that really want to utilize this card. First up, let's talk about that well-known aristocrat commander, Teysa Karlov. She has, if a creature dying causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So yeah, Teysa is basically a Death Harmonicon commander, and yeah, the Meathook Massacre is amazing with her. Again, the Meathook Massacre is a permanent, and it's got death triggers on it, so those will double up. You cast it, you wipe a lot of creatures off the board and drain your opponents for twice as much as you would've and gain twice as much as you would've too. So yeah, Teysa Karlov is most definitely going to want the Meathook Massacre in her 99. Next up, how about Sekuar Deathkeeper? It has, whenever another non-token creature you control dies, put a 3/1 black and red Graveborn creature token with haste onto the battlefield. So wipe out a ton of your small non-token creatures, as well as some of your opponents, drain your opponents, gain some life, and then get a ton of Graveborns. And again, these are hasty 3/1s, so again, swing away to your heart's content. Many of your opponent's blockers might have been wiped out, and if not, even if they block, they're going to be losing life. Next up, how about Elenda the Duskrose? She has, whenever their creature dies, put a +1 counter on Elenda the Duskrose. And whenever Elenda dies, you create X 1/1 white vampire creature tokens with lifelink where X is Elenda's power. So the Meathook Massacre can obviously help out in a lot of ways with this commander. First off, if you need to grow her power, well, just wipe out all these small creatures on the board and grow her to an absurd amount. And then once she is absurdly large, sacrifice her with something else, and then yeah, you get a ton of vampire tokens, and when those die, you're going to be draining your opponents for a ton. And speaking of draining your opponents for a ton, let's talk about Vito, Thorn of the Dusk Rose. Vito is basically a Sanguine Bond as a commander. It says whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life. So obviously, just like Sanguine Bond, whenever you gain life from your opponent's creatures dying, you get to drain them for even more Vito. Or should I say, one very unlucky opponent that you're targeting. Moving on, let's talk about Shirei Shizo's Caretaker. Shirei has, whenever a creature with power 1 or less is put in your graveyard from the battlefield, you may return that card to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step if Shirei Shizo's Caretaker is still on the battlefield. Many of those creatures that have just 1 power in this deck also have 1 toughness, which is perfect for the Meathook Massacre. So you play it, you wipe your own board except for Shirei, and then you get all those creatures back after you drain your opponents for a ton. And of course, you're going to be running plenty of other ways to sacrifice your creatures to drain your opponents even further. Finally, even a commander like Chatterfang can be built in aristocrat-style way. It says if 1 or more tokens be created under your control, those tokens plus that many 1/1 green squirrel creature tokens are created instead. And by paying a black, you can sacrifice X squirrels and target creature gets +X/+X until end of turn. So with the Meathook Massacre, you can take out a ton of your tokens, including your squirrels, and drain your opponents for a ton. And then when you build up your army again, you can use Chatterfang to sacrifice your squirrels to drain your opponents for even more. But now as this episode is coming to a close, it's time for me to wrap things up and give you my final thoughts on the Meathook Massacre. This card is absolutely absurd. Again, it is a flexible board wipe that sticks around as an enchantment that drains your opponents and gains you life. Outside of the price of this card, it's going to be hard to argue against not including it in aristocrat-style deck. And yeah, when it comes to the price of this card, I can easily see this being one of the most expensive cards from this set. First off, obviously this is a mythic rare, so its supply is going to be lower than a lot of other cards that people want. And on top of that, again, aristocrat-style strategies are one of the most popular strategies in Commander, and there's going to be a ton of decks that want this. So unfortunately for my budget decks, I will probably never see the day where I get to use this card, but I'm sure I'm going to have to play against it. And with that, the show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one.